2 days after my grandfather's passing, the house was quiet, with morning shadows moving slowly across the old wooden walls, as if the building itself shared our grief. But the silence didn't last. The sound of a car pulling up the gravel drive broke at each crunch of the tires, too quick, too purposeful. My aunt and her husband had arrived, not with condolences or compassion, but with something colder. They walked in without hesitation, faces drawn not by sadness, but by anticipation, their eyes darting across the room as though they were already dividing the place in their minds. They didn't glance at the chair where my grandfather had so often sat in the evenings, his hands rough and cracked from a day's work. They didn't stop to acknowledge the photographs, the tools, still resting by the door, the scent of wood and earth that still clung to the air. To them, those details were irrelevant. They were here for one purpose: to claim what they believed was theirs. My father was seated at the table, his hands folded, his expression calm, as though he had been expecting them to come so soon. He greeted them politely, not with warmth, but with the kind of composure that unsettles people who thrive on conflict. He had always known this moment would come. My aunt wasted no time pretending. "The farmhouse was settled years ago," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. "Now we need to discuss this house." "The one he built." Her husband, a man whose shoulders seemed always hunched beneath the weight of her ambition, added quickly, "We want our share, and we want it soon. Half is ours. It's only fair." They listed their demands like orders: the land behind the barn, the shed, with the tools, the very bricks and beams of the house my grandfather had raised with his bare hands. I sat in silence, watching, feeling the anger coil in my chest. But my father did not react. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes steady, his mouth curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of kindness, nor of surrender. It was the sly, knowing smile of a man who had already set the board before the first move was played. He listened to everything, nodding at the right moments, as though he agreed, as though he was preparing to hand it all over. The more he accepted their wishes with silence, the more confident they became. My aunt grew bolder, her voice rising as she painted pictures of her new life inside walls she had never lifted a hand to build. She spoke of repainting the rooms, of selling the old furniture, of cutting down the orchard and selling the wood. Her husband spoke of numbers. 50%, half of everything. That's how it should be. The arrogance in their tone filled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. My grandfather, who had broken his back to help them on their farm, despite their constant bullying, was being reduced to a ledger of property and imagined profits. Every sacrifice he had made, every calloused hand and sleepless night, was dismissed as if it were nothing. And still my father said nothing. He let them speak until their voices turned raw, until they believed they had cornered him. He allowed them to see him as compliant, as weak as a man too overwhelmed by grief to resist. He gave them the illusion of victory because he knew what was about to come. When the lawyer arrived and unfolded the papers, the mood in the room shifted. The rustle of the will being laid out on the table was louder than their demands. His voice, steady and clear, carried the weight of my grandfather's final word. The farmhouse had indeed been settled years ago, but the acres of land and the forest surrounding it, originally a wedding gift from my grandmother's parents to my grandfather, were still in his name. Those too were now signed over to my father. And because the farmhouse was only useful, thanks to the electric lines, the water supply, and every essential connection that ran across that land, its very livability was tied to what my father now inherited. The house, built by my grandfather's calloused hands, was left entirely without question to him as well. My aunt's face twisted, her mouth hanging open as if words had abandoned her. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the will and the sly smile now spreading openly across my father's face. They had walked in with greed burning in their hearts, certain they would leave, triumphant, only to find themselves stripped bare by the truth. And my father, still calm, leaned forward and spoke just once. "This house stays with his blood, not with those who despised him." He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, didn't mock their defeat. He simply reminded them that the legacy of a man who worked harder than anyone deserved more respect than their greed could ever give. The sly smile lingered, not of cruelty, but of justice, served quiet, patient, inevitable. The house stood behind him, strong as ever, and they left with nothing but their bitterness clinging to them like a second skin.